Hello, and welcome to the first segment of Digestive System Physiology lecture material. There's a lot of material covered in this one PowerPoint presentation. So for this video recording, I'm going to create 3 separate chunks or segments, as I've been calling them. In this segment, segment number 1, will cover the first 2 bullet points here, and that's slides 1 through 28. In slides 1 through 28, we'll do an overview of organs and functions of the digestive system, and we'll do an overview of mechanisms that regulate the digestive system, and that will be it for the first segment. In the second segment, we'll cover the third bullet point here, processes that occur as food material travels through the GI tract. That's a lot of information in moving from your mouth to your anus. And that will cover slides 29 through 100. And then the third segment will cover the phases of digestion. And then sort of spread out through all 3 segments are these disorders / conditions: choking, gastric reflux, lactose intolerance, diarrhea, and constipation. So the overall function of the digestive system is to break down food molecules and then to bring those broken down food molecules into our bodies as nutrients. And animals are heterotrophs, and a heterotroph is an organism that eats other organisms as their form of nutrition. And an animal is a multicellular heterotroph. So we are definitely multicellular heterotrophs. We're definitely animals. And during digestion, food is taken in, taken apart, and then taken up by our body cells. So we are animals. We are multicellular heterotrophs. Why do we need to eat? There are 2 reasons we need to eat. The first reason we eat is to obtain energy. All living things need a source of energy. They need an energy input. Remember, it requires energy to maintain homeostasis. Growing requires energy. Reproducing requires energy. So all living things, no matter where they get their energy, require energy. And as heterotrophs, we obtain energy by eating other organisms, plants, animals, fungi, etc. The second reason why we eat is to obtain nutrients, and nutrients can be viewed as building blocks that our cells use to manufacture other molecules. So for example, we need amino acids in order to build human proteins, and sometimes those amino acids come from plant proteins. If you eat tofu, for example, tofu is a rich source of plant protein, and all proteins are made out of amino acids. Those amino acids will be used by your cells to build human proteins. And then some nutrients act as cofactors in specific biochemical pathways. Some of the B vitamins, for example, which we'll talk about if we get into metabolism. So just like humans, cats are also animals. They're multicellular heterotrophs, and we can look at the 4 stages of food processing. Ingestion means to take food and beverage by mouth. Digestion involves both mechanical and chemical breakdown of the food material into smaller substances. During absorption, those substances leave the GI tract and one way or another get into your bloodstream. And now they are considered part of your body. And what wasn't absorbed, what remained in your GI tract, gets eliminated during defecation. So these are the 4 stages of food processing. There are many organs of the digestive system. So we recently covered the urinary system. That's relatively simple. The digestive system is far more complex because there are many more organs that are part of the digestive system. So all of these organs are organized in 2 big categories. There is a tube that runs from your mouth to your anus, one continuous tube, and it's made up of separate organs, and all of those organs are called organs of the GI tract. That's one category, that's one bucket for organizational purposes. And the second bucket are accessory organs. So accessory organs are not part of the tube, but they somehow contribute to what's happening inside the GI tract, inside the tube. So here are those two categories, organs of the GI tract, where GI means gastrointestinal. And this GI tract, we'll take a look at the makeup, the anatomy of the GI tract in general in just a moment. It's a tube that's wrapped in multiple layers of smooth muscle, and that smooth muscle will contract to both mix the contents of the tube and propel to push along the material from one region of the tube to the next region. The tube in some places is very convoluted. It's highly folded in order to increase its length. And the longer the tube is, the more opportunity there is for digestive system processes, including digestion and absorption. So it's convoluted in order to increase its length. And then the second category here are the accessory organs. And again, accessory organs don't make up the tube itself, but they somehow contribute to what's happening inside the tube. And so your teeth, your tongue, salivary glands, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, none of these are hollow organs, but rather they contribute to the function of the GI tract. So here's a very basic anatomical diagram featuring just the organs of the GI tract. So every structure listed here is a hollow organ. It has a lumen. And this tube, no matter where we are, whether we're in the esophagus or if we're in the rectum and everywhere in between, this tube has the same basic structure. And we'll take a look at that basic structure in just a little bit. Whatever's inside this tube right now, think about your body, think about what you ate today, breakfast, lunch, dinner, maybe it's Ramadan and you haven't eaten today yet. Whatever's in this tube is not considered part of your body. So it's really considered external to your body. So you're like a giant donut with a hole in the middle. The material that's in that tube only becomes part of your body after a process known as absorption, when those substances get into your blood. So the contents of the GI tract are considered external to your body, and we'll learn how they go from being external to becoming internal when we talk about absorption. This is a very simple anatomical diagram highlighting the accessory structures of the digestive system. So all of the structures shown here are not hollow organs, but they somehow contribute to what's happening inside the tube. And as we go from mouth to anus, we'll talk about the contributions of each of these structures. Here we're looking at an artistic representation of generic GI tract. So this isn't meant to represent any one region of the GI tract, but it's meant to represent all the regions of the GI tract, because anatomically, they all have the same layout. So whether we're looking at esophagus, small intestine, large intestine, all of the structures shown here we'll find. And let me introduce those basic layers to you. And then this is a very simple diagram. There's more detail to cover on the next slide. So let's move from deep to superficial. And so that means we're going to start in the lumen, we're going to start in the cavity, and then work our way outward. So the lumen is lined with epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissues are coverings and linings. So here we're looking at a lining, and the epithelial tissue, it consists of the cells that are actually in physical contact with the food material. In whatever stage of digestion, it's in contact with the food material. And the type of epithelial tissue in our GI tract is going to vary. If you are familiar with epithelial tissues from another course, I'll remind you that your mouth and most of your esophagus is lined with a very tough type of epithelial tissue called stratified squamous epithelial tissue. There are many layers of cells. Layers of cells can be shed, can be sacrificed without compromising the integrity of the tissue. But then when we move into the stomach and the small intestine and the large intestine, the type of epithelial tissue is more delicate because now we're dealing with liquidy things. And that's, if you recall, that's simple columnar epithelial tissue. Okay, so superficial to the epithelium is a layer of connective tissue. And that layer of connective tissue includes blood vessels, nerves. Sometimes it contains glands, depending on where we are in the GI tract. Superficial to the connective tissue layer are at least 2 layers of muscle. And there are 3 layers of muscle in the stomach, but everywhere else in the GI tract, there are 2 layers of muscle. One layer is the circular layer, that's the deeper layer, where those smooth muscle fibers encircle the tube. So when those contract, they pinch the tube, they squeeze the tube, and that will help propel material along the tube. And then superficial to that circular layer is the longitudinal layer. So notice in this drawing, we can see the muscle fibers run along the length of the tube. When those muscle fibers contract, they cause that region of the tube to get shorter. So these 2 muscle layers work together to mix and propel the contents of the tube. The circular layer squeezes and the longitudinal layer shortens. And this combination of squeezing and shortening helps to push material along. And then it's not labeled here, but the superficial most layer, the exterior most layer here, is another layer of epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, remember, is coverings and linings. So now we're looking at a covering. And this tissue changes names. If we're talking about the esophagus, so for a moment, imagine this is the tube that runs from your pharynx to your stomach. If we're in the thoracic cavity, as the esophagus is in the thoracic cavity, that exterior coating is called the adventitia. And now change gears and imagine that this is your small intestine, for example, or any region of the GI tract that's in your abdominopelvic cavity. That exterior coating is called the serosa, and it's the same thing as your visceral peritoneum. That layer of the peritoneum that coats the exterior surface of our organs in our abdominopelvic cavity. This is also a generic diagram of the GI tract. It's not meant to represent any one organ of the GI tract, but it's meant to represent them all. And obviously some more detail is included here. So I'm going to talk you through the 4 layers of the GI tract and just go through much of the detail that appears here. Again, we're going to go from deep to superficial. So we'll start with the mucosa, the first or the deepest layer of the GI tract. The mucosa includes epithelial tissue, that lining that is in contact with the food material itself. Superficial to the mucosa is the submucosa, our second layer of the GI tract. And the submucosa is a layer of connective tissue where we find blood vessels, nerves, and sometimes we find glands. Superficial to the submucosa, we find the muscularis. That's the third region of the GI tract. And the muscularis consists of 2 or 3 layers, distinct layers of muscle. And in the mouth and the upper esophagus, it's skeletal muscle. But for most of the rest of the GI tract, it's smooth muscle. And I want to point out the orientation of the muscle cells in the circular versus the longitudinal layer. So let's start with the circular layer. And the circular layer, these long cylindrical muscle cells, they encircle the tube. So they run perpendicular to the length of the tube. So you can imagine when these muscle cells contract, they're going to squeeze the tube, meaning they're going to narrow the diameter of the lumen of the tube, just like you might squeeze a tube of toothpaste. And then the longitudinal layer, maybe I'll come down here so that you can see these long skinny cells that run the length of the tube. So they run parallel to the length of the tube. And when these long skinny cells contract, they shorten, right? That's what muscle cells do. They get shorter and they shorten the length of the tube. So when the circular and longitudinal layers work together, they both mix the contents of the tube, so stir it around, combine it, and they also propel, they push the contents of the tube along in a downstream fashion toward ultimately the rectum. So that's the muscularis. And then our fourth layer of the GI tract here is labeled as the serosa. So it's the covering. And if we were talking about the esophagus runs through the thoracic cavity. It would be called the adventitia. But in your abdominal pelvic cavity, so the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, we call it the serosa. And it's a covering, so it includes epithelial tissue. And it's the same thing in your abdominal pelvic cavity. It is the visceral peritoneum, which is the serous membrane. So some other details that I'd like to point out here are these two nerve plexuses. Here we have the submucosal plexus and the myenteric plexus. So a plexus is a braided network of nerves. And here we're thinking about the enteric nervous system. So it's one of the branches of the peripheral nervous system. So previously we've studied the somatic nervous system, we've studied the autonomic nervous system, and in this chapter we're going to study the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is responsible for the sensory inputs, the integration, and the motor outputs that are required to digest and absorb our food. So we have these two plexuses here. One of them is called the submucosal plexus. That's a good name for it because it innervates both sensory and motor neurons that serve the mucosa as well as the blood vessels and the glands. And then superficial to that, we have the myenteric plexus. I hope you remember that myo means muscle and enteric means intestine. So the myenteric plexus refers to nerves that innervate the smooth muscle of the muscular, or it's mostly smooth muscle, usually smooth muscle. The myenteric plexus innervates the layers of muscle that form the muscularis of the GI tract. And then two more structures here. They're both glands. There are lots of glands, different kinds of glands in the digestive system. And we have glands that occur as part of the mucosa, and sometimes these glands secrete mucus, sometimes they secrete various digestive fluids like in the stomach or the small intestine. And then we also have glands in the submucosa. Again, these glands, they differ, they secrete different things depending on if we're, say, in the esophagus or we're in the small intestine or the large intestine. And those details will come up as we go region by region. So this is a checklist. We have not talked about all of these structures yet, but we will. So by the time you get to the end of the GI tract, by the time we finish talking about basically defecation, pooping, go back and take a look at this checklist and make sure that you understand all of these structures. Right, so we're still in overview mode. Your digestive system can be viewed as a disassembly line. A disassembly line is where something is taken apart. So we eat mostly macromolecules. Macromolecules means big molecules, like proteins. They're large molecules. But only small molecules can cross our GI tract. Only small molecules can pass through those epithelial cells that line our GI tract. And so how do we go from macromolecules to small molecules that can be absorbed? Well, we need digestion. And there's two different forms of digestion: mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. And we'll talk more about those in just a little bit. And following digestion, we now have the food material in small molecular form, and those small substances can be absorbed. And what's not absorbed remains in the GI tract, and we excrete that material as feces. So let's take a moment to review our biological molecules and their monomer building blocks so that we know we can expect what will be absorbed. So these are, in the table, we see 3 out of the 4 types of biological molecules listed here: carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. Down at the bottom, we see a little note about the 4th type of biological molecule, nucleic acids. And nucleic acids, we obviously eat nucleic acids. We're eating other organisms, so we eat their DNA, we eat their RNA. You eat a salad, you're eating plant DNA and plant RNA. You eat a burger, you're eating cow DNA, cow RNA. But in our coverage of nutrition, nucleic acids are sort of not that important, and we kind of skip over them. There are enzymes that break down nucleic acids so that you can absorb the monomer building blocks, but we're not really going to talk about them. Instead, we're going to focus on carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids. So, carbohydrates, I hope you remember what a carbohydrate is, and I hope you remember what the monomer building block of a carbohydrate is. It's always a monosaccharide, right? Glucose is an example of a monosaccharide. Galactose is another example of a monosaccharide. Fructose is a monosaccharide. And then proteins. I hope you remember what the monomer building block of all proteins is. It's the amino acid. And then lipids. Lipids are a very diverse category in nutrition. In the digestive system and nutrition context, we're really talking about triglycerides. Triglycerides are a type of lipid, and on a food label, lipids are listed as fats. Triglycerides are fats and oils. So when we digest carbohydrates, we digest them down into their monosaccharide building block form, and those monosaccharides are small enough to cross the wall of the GI tract and get into the blood. When we digest proteins, proteins can be thousands of amino acids long. We digest them down into individual amino acids, dipeptides, and tripeptides. All of those are small enough to be absorbed. And then lipids, triglycerides, get digested into fatty acids and monoglycerides, and those are small enough to be absorbed. We absorb other substances that were already small to begin with, so they don't need to undergo any type of digestion. They just need to be absorbed. So water, vitamins, minerals, and phytochemicals. If you've taken nutrition, you're familiar with all of the terms here. And if you have not yet taken nutrition, or maybe you won't ever take nutrition, let me just quickly tell you what a vitamin versus a mineral versus a phytochemical are. Let me explain those to you. So a vitamin is an organic compound. So it's a carbon containing compound, and it is required as a cofactor. It's required in order for some particular biochemical process in your body to occur. And then a mineral is something that appears on the periodic table of elements. So magnesium, calcium, iron, those are all on the periodic table, and they're all minerals. And then phytochemicals, phyto means plant. They're plant chemicals. So if you think about broccoli as an organism, it's a plant, right? It has organ systems, it has organs, it has tissues, it's made out of cells. how many substances are in the body of that broccoli plant. Not all of them fall into the category vitamin or mineral or fiber for that matter. And so the other compounds that make up the body of that plant, those are called phytochemicals. And we're learning more and more the importance of phytochemicals for health. Sometimes it's helpful to look at the end product and then go back to the beginning and figure out how that end product was formed. So this is a list of the components that make up feces. So feces includes digested material that was not absorbed. So the food material gets broken up chemically and mechanically, and as that food material passed through your GI tract, there just wasn't enough time for that material to be absorbed. Feces also includes indigestible material, and we think about that as fiber. So fiber includes cellulose and hemicellulose. These are carbohydrates manufactured by plants. So plants have cell walls. They have a plasma membrane, but their cells are also surrounded by a wall that's composed of cellulose and hemicellulose. And we don't have any enzymes to digest those carbohydrates. So those carbohydrates pass through our GI tracts not modified chemically at all. Chemically, they're intact. And so we call that fiber. And fiber is important because it helps hold water in the GI tract to keep the food material liquidy or at least soft. And it helps the food material move through your GI tract at an adequate rate. So it's a bulking agent. And maybe you've seen evidence in the toilet. As an awake, aware, curious human being, you've looked in the toilet and you've seen evidence of plant material that you've eaten. You've seen corn or peanuts or pieces of lettuce or tomato or whatever. Because those cell walls are, we just don't have any enzymes to digest them. And then water is obviously a component of feces, and the amount of water varies, and that's going to determine the difference between, say, diarrhea and then a very dried out stool. And then number 4, our feces also contain our own cells that are sloughed off from the lining of the GI tract. So the rectum and the anus are lined with stratified squamous epithelial tissue, which is much better at handling like a dry, potentially tough material. It's okay with being scraped during the process of defecation. And all along your GI tract, really, you slough off cells, and they can exit our body as part of our feces. And then stercobilin, I hope you recognize that term. Stercobilin is responsible for making feces brown, and it is a breakdown product ultimately from hemoglobin. You remember that hemoglobin is recycled as red blood cells are broken down, and not all of the components of hemoglobin are useful. Some of them are actual wastes. And one way that that bilirubin leaves the body is it ultimately ends up in our GI tract, where it gets converted into stercobilin, and this is why feces are brown. And then bacteria. So a huge part of your microbiome is the bacteria that live in your large intestine. This is a good thing. They're supposed to be there. They help keep us healthy. And what bacteria do, anywhere, bacteria, they eat and divide, they eat and divide, eat and divide. And so they're sort of feeding off your food scraps, so to speak. As the partially digested material reaches your large intestine, there are nutrients available there to sustain a very rich microbial community. And as those bacteria eat and divide, their numbers increase. And so you need to shed them, or else you would become very quickly full of bacteria. And so think about this the next time you look in the toilet. Your stool can be up to 25% bacteria. So following absorption, which we will talk about in detail a little bit later, following absorption, these nutrients get into your blood And if you'll recall from the cardiovascular system, once something's in the blood, then all of your body cells have access to that. So your blood is a delivery system, right? It picks up these nutrients in your GI tract, and then that blood continues to circulate throughout your cardiovascular system, and these nutrients become available to other cells, tissues, and organs. And these nutrients are used for all sorts of functions. These nutrients can be used to create ATP. These nutrients can be used to serve as building blocks for the production of new molecules. Or these nutrients, many of them, can be put into storage for later use. I love this image. I still find it astonishing. As many times as I've looked at it, as many times as I've taught it, the volumes here are still shocking. So these volumes here are in milliliters, and I'll remind you that 1 liter is 1,000 milliliters. So if you can imagine a liter bottle, like a water bottle, that's 1 liter. That's 1,000 milliliters. So with that in mind, let's just go top to bottom. So up top, on an average day, a typical person might ingest 1.2 liters of water and between 0.5 and that's in grams, between 500 and 800 grams of solids ingested a day. So that goes through your oral cavity, into your esophagus, through your stomach, etc. Salivary secretions. So this is in your mouth. That's 1.5 liters, 1,500 milliliters of saliva. You secrete 1.5 liters of saliva every day. You swallow it. Once we get into your stomach, gastric means stomach. 2 liters of gastric secretions produced every day. And then we move into your small intestine, and we're still continuing sort of on the right-hand side of this image. And what we see there is a liver, a gallbladder, and a pancreas. And you make 0.5 liter of bile per day. We'll talk more about what bile is and what its role is. You make 1.5 liters of pancreatic juice. That's the technical term, pancreatic juice. And both bile and pancreatic juice are delivered into the small intestine. Continuing on the right side of that diagram, you make 1.5 liters, 1,500 milliliters of intestinal juice. And so now we can sort of move over to the left side of the diagram and look at the volumes of fluid that we absorb. So the vast majority of all absorption occurs in your small intestine. Some of it also occurs in your large. So a lot of what we absorb consists of the fluids that we secreted. So the fluids that we secreted on the right make up huge components of the fluids that, or the substances that get absorbed on the left. Of course, we also absorb materials from the foods and beverages that we ingested. So that's 6.7 liters are absorbed every day in your small intestine. Another 1.4 liters or 1,400 milliliters get absorbed in your large intestine. And we'll talk a lot more about secretion and absorption in each section of the GI tract. All right, so how are the activities of the GI tract regulated? Meaning controlled or influenced, what determines their behavior. And the GI tract is regulated both by neural mechanisms, so the enteric nervous system, and hormonal mechanisms, the endocrine system. And once again, this is an example of where the nervous system and the endocrine system thoroughly overlap. So these neural and hormonal mechanisms govern muscle contractions, and those muscle contractions are needed for mixing and propulsion in the GI tract. And then secretions from glands. You remember that muscle cells and glands are effectors in the nervous system, including the enteric nervous system. And then there are many dozens and dozens of gut hormones, and where hormones are signaling molecules. And I hope you remember a signaling molecule is a chemical message that's produced by one cell. Here it's called the sending cell. And the signaling molecule is also a ligand because it will bind to a receptor on the target cell. And once the signaling molecule binds to its receptor, then that initiates a signal transduction pathway in the target cell, and the target cell will change its behavior. This is a lovely diagram trying to simplify the enteric nervous system. So the enteric nervous system is sometimes referred to as the brain of the gut, where maybe you can think of it almost as like a microprocessing system. So a lot of digestive system activities happen on their own without any governance from your central nervous system. So your brain and your spinal cord, not so involved in digestive system activities. Do they have an influence? Absolutely. But are they calling the moment-to-moment shots? No, not at all. Rather, your enteric nervous system is responsible for sensory input. There are a variety of sensory receptors in your digestive system, and your enteric nervous system is responsible for integration, combining multiple sensory inputs, analyzing them, and determining the appropriate motor output. Motor output is always to either a muscle cell or a gland, so muscle contraction and glandular secretion. All of these are governed by the enteric nervous system. Down here, let me highlight that for you and introduce this book. So this is a book that I typically bring to class, and it's called What's Your Poo Telling You? And it's very thin, it's light, it's humorous, where it reads like an encyclopedia of different types of poops. And it was written by a physician, so it's pretty factually accurate, and it's humorous. And so I have these little reminders throughout this lecture for me to share with you a chapter that's in this book. And this book is written, again, sort of like an encyclopedia. So one entry in this book, I don't have the book with me, unfortunately. I forget the title. The titles are always like sort of catchy and clever. But let me tell you about some early research in the discovery of the enteric nervous system. I forget the physician's name, but what he did was to dissect out a colon from a guinea pig, the large intestine. He dissected that out, and he was able to keep it alive. So the tissues were alive for a while. And we have this dissected guinea pig colon, and he had it in a dissection tray along with this solution that keeps the cells alive. And he put down at one end of the colon, he put a pellet of food. And the colon propelled that pellet of food from one end to the other. So the muscularis layer of the GI tract got very busy, performing a wave-like action called peristalsis that just propelled that food pellet right along. So clearly, the central nervous system was not necessary for that to occur. There was sensory input, there was integration, there was motor output, and there was no central nervous system involvement. So that led to a whole world of research and understanding on the enteric nervous system. This is a slightly more complicated diagram, but I love it. There's a lot to be gleaned here if you want to spend some time with it. It's not required. I included it in case you want to take your understanding a little further. It came from Nature Reviews. In addition to the enteric nervous system, activities of the GI tract are also regulated by many different GI hormones. And these hormones are secreted by enteroendocrine cells. Entero means intestine, and endocrine cells secrete signaling molecules. And so these enteroendocrine cells are found in the mucosa, the epithelial lining of the GI tract, and they are hormone-producing cells. And as we see in this panel on the left, we see these enteroendocrine cells secreting the signaling molecules, and those signaling molecules get into the blood, so they are circulating hormones. And like any hormone, they act on a target tissue, and that target tissue has receptors for that hormone. And in response to that hormone, the target tissue will change its behavior. So there are enteroendocrine cells throughout our GI tract that send signals that modify the behavior of different tissues and organs in the GI tract. And there are many different gut hormones. We're just going to cover two. We'll talk about gastrin, which is secreted by enteroendocrine cells in the lining of the stomach. And we'll talk about cholecystokinin, also known as CCK. And that's secreted by enteroendocrine cells in the small intestine. So digestion. Digestion is the breakdown of food material into smaller molecules. And there are two different types of digestion: mechanical digestion and chemical digestion. During mechanical digestion, bigger food pieces are broken down into smaller food pieces, and there are no chemical changes. No enzymes are involved, no chemical bonds are broken. And so here's an example of mechanical digestion. The fancy word for chewing is mastication. So you take a bite out of a sandwich, and maybe that sandwich includes some bread and some cheese, and you chew it up. And in the chewing process, you mix that food material with saliva, and you just make smaller pieces of bread and smaller pieces of cheese. But the molecules are all the same. No chemical reactions occur during mechanical digestion. And then during chemical digestion, that's when enzymes are involved and chemical reactions occur. So during chemical digestion, larger molecules are broken down, they're catabolized into smaller molecules, and then those smaller molecules may be absorbed. And chemical digestion is performed by many different digestive enzymes, and I hope you remember that enzymes are specific. So a particular enzyme has a particular substrate and gives rise to a particular product. So we'll talk about several, certainly not all, of the digestive system enzymes, but in our coverage we'll talk about carbohydrate digesting enzymes, we'll talk about protein digesting enzymes, and we'll talk about lipid digesting enzymes. There are also nucleic acid digesting enzymes that we're not covering. We can use the events that occur in your mouth as an example of several of the concepts that we've covered so far. So your mouth, your oral cavity, is part of the GI tract. So it is an organ of the GI tract. And then there are accessory organs involved: your teeth, your tongue, and your salivary glands. So when you take a bite of food and you chew it, when you masticate it, your teeth and your tongue are helping to perform mechanical digestion. So let's say you take a bite of that cheese sandwich. You're chewing it. Your tongue is moving it around. Your teeth are biting it into smaller and smaller pieces of cheese sandwich. And your salivary glands are producing saliva, and that helps moisten the food. Some of those food molecules dissolve in saliva, and that's why you can get the yummy taste from your cheese sandwich. We'll talk about that more in a little bit. And so mechanical digestion is happening as your cheese sandwich gets smaller and broken down into smaller and smaller pieces. One component of saliva is salivary amylase. Salivary amylase is an enzyme. It ends in ase, right? And it might help you to know that amylose is a polysaccharide. It's a starch. So amylase breaks up amylose, and salivary amylase, just the salivary, indicates that it's part of your that it's produced by your salivary glands. We also have an amylase that's produced by our pancreas. That's pancreatic amylase. And so in your mouth, we have both mechanical and chemical digestion. Chemical digestion occurs as salivary amylase breaks down starch into smaller carbohydrates. So starch is a polysaccharide, and it consists of thousands of units of monosaccharide, right? That's the monomer building block of a polysaccharide. Thousands of units of monosaccharide all connected together, and the salivary amylase starts to clip apart the monosaccharides. And in your GI tract, ultimately, that starch is going to be broken down to monomer building blocks, to individual units of sugar, to monosaccharides. But all of that is not going to happen in your mouth. If you take a bite of cheese sandwich, right, there's starch in the bread, and the chemical digestion of starch will begin in the mouth, but it won't be completed in the mouth. It will move to completion as that food material passes through your stomach and into your small intestine. But the process of mechanical and chemical digestion begins in your mouth. And this brings us to the end of the first segment. So we're on slide, I believe it's slide 28, slide 29. And in the next segment, in segment 2, we'll pick up with the processes that occur as we move through the GI tract. So we've already started. We started to talk about the digestive system processes that happen in the mouth. And here I've used it as a way to reinforce the concepts of organs of the GI tract versus accessory organs, and mechanical digestion versus chemical digestion. And we'll pick up with the mouth in segment 2. Thanks for watching.